Hi guys! In the past couple of years, we've been talking a lot about all the different elements that have to be taken into account while designing an effective training program. And today, we're going to put it all together and see how it all fits on the bigger picture without going too deep on anything specific. So the assumption is that you already have some basic understanding of training methodology. And if you've been following this channel for some time, you probably are good to go. But otherwise, the information is there, guys. I know these videos look deceptively simple because I'm just standing here and talking, but in reality, I'm combining information from hundreds of books and magazines for you guys here and trying to summarize it in the most coherent and comprehensive manner possible. And today, we're going to put all those different pieces of puzzle together. So it should be a very interesting video. Let's start by talking about some of the general considerations that have to be taken into account while designing an effective training program. And the first one's pretty obvious. Why are you doing this? What is your goal? And it could even be something like a dream, because it just has to be specific enough to give us some sort of direction. You might have heard an expression, you can't hit a target if you don't know what it is. And just because you're expending energy doesn't necessarily mean that you actually getting anything accomplished. So for example, I could run in place here all day without actually getting anywhere. People talk a lot about having to work hard, but you also have to work smart. And that's what this channel is all about. It's about getting the most out of the time and effort you spend at the gym without having to take steroids. And having a clear vision of what you're trying to accomplish is a good place to start. And so that would be an analogy to a long-term goal. So for example, my dream is to be Mr. Olympia. But now I have to figure out how to actually get there and what does it take to be a Mr. Olympia. So I have to have sufficient muscle mass. I have to have well-balanced physique. I have to have certain percentage of body fat. But since our time and resources are limited, it is not always possible to accomplish all of those things at the same time. And then on top of that, training modes that are optimal for developing some qualities could actually be incompatible with training modes that are optimal for developing others. So for example, things that I do to lose body fat could actually interfere with me trying to gain muscle mass, which requires that the training process is broken down into more manageable pieces, which is what short-term goals are all about. The second factor we have to take into account is our training experience. And as most of you probably know, the beginner is somebody who's been trained for less than 1 year. Now the intermediate is a little more vague, but somewhere around 2 to 3 years after the beginner stage. And the advanced is what comes after. Now, we are talking about proper training here and not just how long you had a gym membership for. And it's very important to be humble about this and realistically determine where you actually fall, because that will enable you to select the training methodology that is the most appropriate for your level. Because the word advanced is not synonymous to the best in this context. So for example, when people talk about the most advanced fighter jet, what they're implying is that that is the best fighter jet. But that's not what it means here. And so for example, if the beginner decides to skip to something like 5-3-1, that training program is designed to increase your main lifts by 5 to 10 pounds about once a month, which would actually be a pretty slow rate of progress for beginner. And that's why something like starting strength would probably be more appropriate. So once again, it's very important to understand what this actually means. And we spoke about this in one of my previous videos, but you can also check out Practical Programming by Mark Ripito. He does an excellent job explaining this topic. The third factor that we have to consider is what have you been doing in the gym lately? And this is important due to the following reasons. So number one is to avoid accommodation. So I'm sure you have heard everything works but nothing works forever. And what that actually means is that you have to employ at least some type of variation to avoid stagnation with your training. Now the second one is to maximize transfer. So let's look at the following example. Let's say I decided to focus on bodybuilding for 2 months, after which I decided to switch to long distance running for 2 months, after which I decided to focus on powerlifting for another 2 months. Now, the gains that I made was my muscle mass during the bodybuilding phase will have very little benefit during the following long distance running phase. And if anything, all that additional weight will probably hinder my performance, at least initially. Now, the improvement with my endurance that I attained during the long distance running phase will have very little benefit during the following powerlifting phase, because endurance is a very insignificant component of powerlifting. So hopefully this example illustrates how that type of planning would be very far from optimum, and if anything, I would be just wasting my time. And that's why it's very important to sequence different phases of training in the way where each following phase is benefiting from the gains made during the previous phase, which is what phase potentiation is all about. Now, the third one here is to allow recovery. So you should know that after a period of very hard training that could be considered something like concentrated loading, where you know that you were overreaching, you have to schedule periods of lighter training to allow recovery and avoid overtraining. And mental aspect is a big part of it. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about shuffling things around to prevent boredom here, because I personally never get bored during training. And if there was a training program that keeps giving me good results, I will keep using that program for as long as it's working. And if it's not working, that's a little different story. But what we are talking about here is taking a break from a gym wars. Because, for example, no matter how much you love training, you will still need periods of time where you sort of kind of step back and decompress a little bit. And another part of this is that it's much easier to push yourself when you see the light at the end of the tunnel. So for example, when you have 500 pounds on your shoulders, it is much easier to squeeze out that extra rep when you know that you have a deload in a couple of weeks, while otherwise you might just play it safe and sort of try to conserve your energy. So these are some of the considerations that you have to take into account while designing a training program. And it's very important to understand that none of this should happen by accident. You don't make progress by accident. You don't overtrain by accident. And you should be knowledgeable enough to be able to predict different outcomes of various decisions that you're making while designing a training program, which will necessitate at least some level of planning in your training process, which of course brings us to the topic of periodization. So we're going to try to uncomplicate all this today. And all periodization really is how you structure your training. And that has different implications when you're looking at a training process on different levels. So think of Google Maps for a moment. Let's imagine we decided to look at New York State, and now all we can see is different cities. Now if I was to zoom in on a particular city, now I'm able to see what different blocks look like. If I was to zoom in on a particular block, now I'm able to see what different buildings look like. It's the same thing here. Like I said, this is just looking at training process on different scale, and this just happened to be the terminology that people are using. So roughly speaking, when we're talking about microcycle, we are talking about matter of days. When we're talking about mesocycle, we are talking about matter of weeks. And when we're talking about macrocycle, we are talking about matter of month. So like I said, we're not splitting atoms here, and just because I drew a little graph here doesn't mean that I'm ready to apply for NASA engineering. So now let's talk about what these things actually mean. And the easiest way to think of a macrocycle is something like a season. So something that has some kind of finale at the end of it. Obviously, it's a lot easier if you actually compete, because your preparation for competition will be your macrocycle. But even if you don't compete, it is still very beneficial to have a specific date on which you're going to conduct some type of formal evaluation of your progress. So for example, I personally love to train, and I always train very hard. But I can honestly tell you that when I have a fight date on my calendar, somehow I train even harder, because having that deadline gives you this sense of urgency where you get tunnel vision and you just start to execute. So I highly recommend that even if you don't compete, you schedule dates on which you're going to perform some type of assessment. And obviously it's a little more straightforward if you are a strength athlete, because you just max out on your lifts. But even if you are more of a physique athlete, you can still take pictures in different bodybuilding poses, or perform various body measurements, such as like skin fold measurement, for example. I highly recommend that you actually do it because it makes things a lot more fun and can even reignite your passion for this. And next thing you know, during the following macro cycle, you are even more disciplined with your diet or maybe even training harder. So now let's talk about mesocycles. As you might remember earlier, we said that sometimes long-term goals have to be broken down into smaller, more manageable pieces. And that's what mesocycles are all about. It's the period of time allotted to develop in a specific quality. And they're usually 3 to 6 weeks. So anything less than 3 weeks and you're probably not making any meaningful progress. Because for example, if yesterday you were building muscles, today you're trying to get stronger and tomorrow you're trying to lose weight, you're probably not getting very far. On the other hand, if it's much longer than 6 weeks, you might start running into problems of accommodations. But there are exceptions to this because some mesocycles have variation built into them. So my first advanced training program would be a good example of that. And if anything, it would probably be foolish to use that program for just 3 weeks. So these are some of the common types of mesocycles that are used in resistance training. So we have volume and intensity, preparation and competition using weightlifting, accumulation, realization, and hypertrophy and strength. Now these columns are not exactly the same thing, although they are similar, because when you are on this side, you are probably training with higher volume but lesser intensity. And when you are on this side, you are probably training with higher intensity but lesser volume. So this is what this wavy pattern is coming from. Although in real life, it wouldn't exactly look like that, because when you are in hypertrophy phase, for example, you could keep your intensity constant while the volume would be increasing. So something like step loading, for example. Now these periods over here used to be referred to as transitional periods, but more commonly known as deloads these days. So as you probably know, their purpose is to allow you to recover from the last few weeks of the previous mesocycle when your hardest training was probably taking place. And how much you're going to have to step back will obviously depend on how hard this training was. And the way I personally do it is that I start each new mesocycle with the weights that I know are going to feel as a joke. So while I'm taking a breather, I'm still kind of hinting to my body that it's time to readjust because we are moving into a different mesocycle. Now obviously it is beneficial to schedule these periods during the time when you won't be able to train very hard anyway. So like family vacation or during the week where you're planning to move to a different apartment. But that's just a benefit of planning ahead of time. There are many other types of mesocycles, but for our purposes, we're going to focus mostly on these. And the only one I'm going to add here is the GPP, General Physical Preparation Training. And although that could be a whole separate video, I'm just going to mention briefly here how I personally utilize them. So sometimes, no matter how meticulous I am with my calculations, and I'm moving from high volume to high intensity and so on, and I still fail to make any significant progress. And you will not always know what happened. Perhaps you miscalculated. I personally suspect it has something to do with the insulin sensitivity, because those are also the times when I start noticing that I am getting fat for no particular reason. But in any case, those are usually the times when I interject a GPP block of training. And I always use my strength and conditioning phase that I presented about a year ago. And somebody noticed that the way that program is presented in the video is not exactly the same as in my book, Fit in 1 Year. But the reason for that is that in that book, that program is only part of much broader training plan, and that's why it doesn't look exactly the same. But let's just go back to the level of macrocycle for a moment. So the way you schedule different mesocycles during a particular macrocycle is that you are moving from the variation to specificity. So you always want to finish macrocycle with the mesocycle that is the closest to whatever you're going to be tested on. And so, for example, if you're a bodybuilder, obviously you want to finish with the hypertrophy mesocycle. If you are a powerlifter, you want to finish with the strength mesocycle. And by definition, GPP is the least specific training that you could possibly be doing. So just make sure that you don't schedule that type of training too close to the finish line. So now we are down to the level of a microcycle. And so this is what your actual training program is going to look like during a particular mesocycle of training. And obviously it's going to be very specific to whatever mesocycle you are currently in. And the only thing we're going to add to that is that they are usually 1 week long, which is a matter of pure convenience. But before we go any further, I just want to say something real quick here. As you might have noticed, this discussion is very, very dense because I'm trying to cover a very broad topic in this video. And if you feel that some of this information is sort of flying over your head, perhaps it will be a good idea for you to pause this video and go back to some of the videos that are posted on this channel earlier. And more specifically, my Theory of Strength Training playlist. You can also check out my books on Amazon, and if you watch this video on YouTube, I will include links to them in the description. Because as I said in the beginning, this is more of a summary, and you would be able to absorb this information at a very different level if you already have some basic understanding of all the different elements that we are trying to combine here.